Hello, this is Kimonokai, and I wanted to make a response video to Sargon of Akkad. I enjoy his videos, but recently he made some comments that I found interesting, and I wanted to offer my attempt at a rebuttal. Let's see, these comments are over two videos. The first one was he mentioned it in passing in one of his streams, I think it was, about transhumanism and mind uploading, and so I wanted to talk about that. And I also wanted to talk about his video involving the video that one of the videos he recently released where he did some sort of political quiz or something like that. And I took a few notes, and I wanted to go over them. I'm going to primarily talk about the video that he came out with more recently because I think that's going to provide the context for our rebuttal for his transhumanist comments. Alright, so the first thing on the list is meaning and whether it exists in the universe objectively independent of human perception. I want to challenge the argument that Sargon makes that you can imbue your life with meaning. I find this kind of hard to believe given that, generally speaking, people don't really make meaning, they find it. Generally, your appreciation for something exists there prior to you coming to it. So, for instance, some people find meaning in creating art, for instance, or YouTube videos, or political commentary, or writing, or running for office, or being an activist, or what have you. But those ideas predate you being there. Right? Your political aspirations generally are derived from previous people's aspirations, and you're sort of more adopting them as your own. You didn't really make that. That's something that you are finding meaningful. But did you really make it meaningful to you? Is that something you consciously chose to say, look, I want to find meaning in activism, or was it more thrust upon you, much in the same way that you can't you see colors, you hear sounds, you have sensations of touch and feeling. Which of those sound more likely to be how people treat meaning in their lives? I mean, you generally can't make meaning. Otherwise, there wouldn't be people. Otherwise, there wouldn't be Tumblr. Let's be real. If you could make meaning, there wouldn't be Tumblr. Half the nonsense they do is because you really can't create meaning. You have to find it. And if you live in an echo chamber, meaning's going to be a little harder to find. But I wanted to provoke that as an idea. That's not really an argument, but that was something that I thought was I'm a little skeptical on that response. Now, as far as an argument that I think I actually do have, I wanted to bring up what I call Vecna's dilemma, or the Lich's dilemma. And this is primarily in contradiction with the idea that morality is entirely subjective, or that morality is entirely based on your emotions and desires. Because what I want to challenge is the idea that there isn't, in a sense, a kind of objective morality. I'll get to that in a minute. That there is a difference between working out in your own best interests and being a moral person. So the dilemma goes as follows. So let's assume that we're putting on our make-believe hats and just give me the benefit of the doubt that we can upload our minds to a computer. This isn't whether we can or not is not actually truly essential to my argument, but it does help illustrate the idea behind what I'm saying. So I hope to have a little bit of license in that. All right. So let's suppose you can upload yourself to a computer, and then let's suppose someone can go in with software to edit the way you feel about things and edit certain brain functions. Again, if you need to replace this with nanites and keep it physical, that's fine, but I think computer editing makes it easier to visualize what I'm talking about. The question is, why should you keep your moral sense? If morality indeed is your desires and your drives, if there's no differentiation between those, then why would you not opt to have that taken care of? Why should you, in the situation where you could be an absolute tyrant and actually get away with it, why shouldn't you? Now, obviously, and so the reason why I call it Vecna's dilemma, I prefer that over Lich's dilemma, is because the idea here is that you are the first person to upload, or you're the first person to encounter some great technology that gives you ridiculous leverage relative to the rest of the world. So let's say you designed the net. You like I don't know. Maybe you developed the first real functioning quantum computer or something, and you are so far ahead of the rest of society that you can leverage that to gain control over society. Why should you not become a tyrant? Why shouldn't you, if you can get away with it? Obviously, I'm not saying that, there isn't a kind of useful morality where you sort of fall in line to society because you benefit from it. I'm saying that's totally a thing. But are you then going to claim that there is that the set of actions that can benefit yourself at the expense of your society or community, are you going to claim that that's empty? I don't think that's likely. I think there are situations in which you can net gain, across your life, you can gain while society suffers, maybe in a minor way, maybe in a major way. It doesn't have to be big. It can be like selling a candy bar from the store. Not many people are going to be harmed from your specific decision. Obviously, you can look at it in an aggregate, but at the end of the day, on an individual basis, it's not going to kill anybody. But at the same token, though, you are gaining at the detriment of society at the end of the day. And it might be overall in your best interest that a little bit of thievery isn't really going to upset your world, but you really would like that candy bar. Just as a minor thing. Obviously, there's bigger, moral crises at work. But at the end of the day, you'll have to argue as to why it is that you would find it beneficial as an egoist to retain your moral sense if you can reason your way without it. Nothing stops you from simply getting rid of your moral sense and simply just acting in a way that is most rational and most to your best interests. Why would you keep a biological mechanism that might put you in danger in situations that you shouldn't be put in danger with, or situations that aren't to your own benefit? Furthermore, if you're purely a materialist, naturalist, I should say. By materialism, I'm more meaning in the Hobbesian term, not like materialism is like love of money or anything like that. How can you justify having an irrational emotional desire to want to see the longevity of, say, your children or society or whatever it might be? Why should you not be selfish to the absolute maximum that is reasonable? Like, why should you not maximize your ability to be selfish? Why shouldn't you? How is there any benefit to you other than this supposed dopamine rush that you might get by, quote, feeling like you're doing a good thing or whatever it might be, or love or whatever it might be? Why wouldn't you just try to remove that if you had the opportunity to? Again, the question is not whether you can or not. That's not really relevant. The question is, if you had the ability to remove your moral sense, why should you not remove your moral sense and stick with pure, rational thought? You do things specifically because they are in your best interest and will maximize your pleasure and reduce your suffering to the absolute zenith. Like, you simply just optimize it in a mathematical sense. I don't see why you can't get rid of your moral sense and keep your pleasure. I don't see why you can't get rid of one and simply just be a pleasure seeker who's purely rational and always acts into their own best interest. And if it's your own best interest to play by society's rules because you don't want to go to prison or anything like that, great. But no, you don't necessarily have to have a moral sense to do that. Sure, moral sense might help, but you don't require it. And in the situation where you can benefit at society's detriment, then as an egoist, as a pure naturalist, why shouldn't you do that? Why shouldn't you place your own value and your own desire for pleasure or whatever it might be above that of society? I don't see how that makes any sense. Socialism is always terrible. Right, you mentioned that, if ends, something about ends justifying means or something like that. I think it was, I'm sorry, I'm doing just a take on this. I'm not really editing this. You mentioned that socialism, maybe it might be good in theory. I disagree entirely with this argument. Socialism is awful from the get-go. It's not constructed well at all. I maybe will release a different video on why I think socialism just sucks, but it's terrible even on paper. The argument that socialism is great on paper doesn't work in reality is nonsense. not only does it not work in reality, but it's nonsense on paper as well. All right, you brought up aliens, and I find that very interesting. One of the main issues that I have with a purely naturalistic point of view is that it seems fairly reasonable with our understanding of evolutionary biology to suggest that there should be extraterrestrial intelligences in the universe, and yet we don't hear a whisper. Now, you might want to claim government cover-up. I think that's nonsense. I don't see any evidence of that. The government's too incompetent to cover up stuff for too long. I mean, there's a reason why we know of MK Ultra. It's because the government's incompetent. Oh, sorry, Area 51. That's the example I'd rather use. Yeah, we've known about Area 51 long before the government came forward with it because the government's incompetent. So, no, the Fermi paradox is a real problem, and I do not see a satisfying answer among the naturalist explanations for why it is that there should be just a smorgasbord of aliens, and yet we see none. That seems highly unlikely, and some of the solutions to that problem seem a little concerning, and I would like to get back to at some point, maybe in a different video. For split brain and consciousness, okay, right, these are my notes, just FYI, I'm reading them off to sort of inspire my thought pattern, or thought process. One of the things that you were bringing up was the idea that the mind is sort of the sum of the parts, and this ties into your argument that we can't upload ourselves to computers. I really want to challenge that, because what a thought experiment would be, what if you had somebody with a split brain operation, so they've had the connections between their left and right hemispheres removed. Let's suppose you did Nightmare Before Christmas-like and ripped out one of the hemispheres. You're still there. Like, half of you is still in your mind. I mean, you've lost a crap ton of your ability to do certain things, but you're still a person. Some people have their entire half of their hemisphere removed because they have stroke or whatever it might be, and they have it completely removed, and they're still them. My question would be, why is it not reasonable to suggest that you couldn't digitalize one of your hemispheres and replace one of your biological hemispheres with a digital hemisphere that connects to your brain with like chemical replicators and stuff like that? I mean, with hypothetical nanites, you can easily create nanites that simulate the dendritic connections and can connect and disconnect as your brain does on its own and send chemical signals and whatever. But having the actual hemisphere itself be entirely on the computer, where the only thing that's actually connecting to your actual biological hemisphere are these nanites that are sending chemical signals, like they're just simply connected to your dendrites. Why is this not a reasonable possibility? And why is it the case that you cannot move your consciousness to the brain, or sorry, not the brain, to a computer? Why can't you do that? I'm not seeing strong evidence of this. I don't see why. If I can ship a Theseus, your brain cells, one nanite at a time, replace each brain cell with a nanite that does basically the same thing, I don't see why you no longer exist once I get rid of your brain cells. I don't see any biological magic for why it is you have consciousness. And then I can just do the same again, I can Theseus again with the digital neurons. I can simply replace each nanite with a digital neuron and just keep doing this piece by piece by piece. I don't see why there's any reason why you would at any point start to fade and no longer have consciousness. I would suspect that you would have consciousness up to the last minute. I don't see consciousness fading. I mean, you have to explain to me how that's possible that we can imagine such a thing and yet not be able to upload our minds to a computer. It doesn't have to be a scan and upload. It can be literally like nanite by nanite, we go through the brain and it replaces it. Might be really quick, it might be within like a few minutes or seconds or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's just replacing the neurons one by one and then uploading them individually. Nothing stops that with a significant enough computing power. All right. Okay. Next thing, you answered with the video you made. You answered that we should not strive towards utopia, but we should make incremental steps. I don't see this as being different. It seems to me you seem to think that there's a difference here. I don't see it. I think that when you're striving towards utopia, the incremental steps are still striving towards utopia. You're still trying to get to utopia. You're just taking a longer path to it. I mean, I personally think that's a better option. I don't think that the secular libertarian utopia is a good thing. I think that it's nonsense. But I think that libertarianism and secularism are pragmatically good and useful in the here and now, I don't see it ending necessarily well. I don't see society necessarily getting better. I see society better off now than it was, but I don't necessarily see that transaction being, or that transition into the future being indefinite. I'm not convinced of this, and I don't see the evidence for it, to be honest. We're starting to get into a situation where our technology is starting to outpace our ability to deal with the social consequences of technology. Now, I am very pro-technology, I want to be very clear, but I don't think it can be argued that there are some rather big issues that we're not really dealing with. I mean, think about the recent situation where some scientists in China claim to have done genetic modification on an infant. We really need to have that conversation, and we are really not having that conversation like we should be. All right, next on the list is inherent morality. So you seem to have a very strong stance towards morality, but you seem to suggest that it's not inherent. At the same time, you clicked that you disagreed that morality wasn't inherent. It's clear that you do think that morality is not inherent to reality. That is, it is not something that's objective that we can discover. Now, I think that's clearly false for two reasons. First off, I think that the moral axioms are harder to find, but I don't see evidence that they don't exist, and I'll get to that in a minute. But there is a factual morality that you can derive. There is an objective moral system where, I mean, if you want to go like egoism as a baseline, I think that's sufficient. I don't think egoism leads you to actual proper virtue, but I think it's decent enough in most situations. You can derive expected utility, maximizing your goals to maximize your pleasure. Again, I want to go back to the Vecna's dilemma. By the Vecna is named after the D&D god. Yes. I'm not claiming that working in your own best interest is necessarily a bad thing. I want to be very clear. I'm not suggesting that. With that, I am contrasting that with suggesting that there might be situations where you might benefit while society suffers. That is not necessarily the same thing as saying that it's entirely subjective and based entirely on your values, when you can make probabilistic guesses as to the most likely method of advancing your interests. And that is objective. You can make an objective system out of that. So the idea that morality is entirely subjective seems to be clearly false, because you can create expected utility. So you can create systems that try to maximize people's happiness and people's outcomes. You can design metrics that do that. And if you can design a metric to measure people's happiness and try to push towards that, you are creating an objective morality. Now, this contrasts with the axioms, so the values and the reasons why, the reasons why you're trying to strive for, the things you're trying to strive for rather than the striving. So the striving seems to be very objective. It's not subjective, it's objective. There are objectively good ways and objectively bad ways to try to achieve your goals. I mean, Hillary Clinton has realized that it's an objectively, she might be pro-migrant, but being openly pro-migrant is an objectively bad thing to do in this current political stage. And it's a good example right there. You might desire it, but it might not necessarily be in your best interests to do it the way that you've been doing it. All right, so I would like to see evidence that there's no objective morality. Just because people have different moralities, and just because people have different opinions on how morality should be, doesn't necessarily mean that morality isn't objective. It can be very well the case that no one has the correct morality, but it still exists. Because fundamentally, in order for you to claim that there is no objective morality, you would have to make a strange claim. You have to make the claim that given any extraterrestrial species that exists, with particular attention to worlds that are nothing like ours, where the rules for survival are very different, it would be very ideal for this particular problem. You would have to claim that they cannot come to, there is no reason why we should expect that they would have any moral system anywhere close to our moral system. And that as one moves further away from the world like ours, we should expect their moral systems to also diverge as their world diverges. And that's not necessarily true. Because again, we're not really interested in insectoid aliens. We're not interested in the Tyranids or anything like that, or any species like the Necrons. We're interested in beings that have sentience. I mean, well, obviously, Necron lords have sentience. You know what I mean. So beings that have sentience and are capable of rationalizing, beings that have a theory of mind like we do. So, i.e., beings that are conscious. and have an inner world like we humans do, there's no reason to think that they might not develop a similar moral system as us, even in situations where the same evolutionary conditions do not necessarily apply. I'm not necessarily saying that it's going to happen, but I'm saying you don't have evidence that it won't. And unless you have evidence that it won't do this, I would like to see more evidence that morality is entirely, the moral axioms, I should say, and moral values are entirely subjective. Some of them might be, but some of them might not be. And for you to declare that for all axioms they are subjective, I'd like to see some evidence for that. Unless you're just going to assert that as a actual axiom, say, well, I don't need evidence. This is just something I'm coming into the gate assuming. Then fair enough. Which is my next point. I would like you to clarify some of the axioms you use when you're making some of these arguments, because it seems like you're making some assertions, but you're not necessarily backing them up, because axioms are things you aren't reasoning. You aren't necessarily saying, well, some axioms can be reasoned, but generally speaking, people use the term axiom to mean things you're just asserting without having any. You're not necessarily having evidence for it. So you were making the claim that you should not accept claims without evidence. Well, there's a certain point in which you can't have evidence. There's a pre-evidential position you have to start from, for instance, for some issues. And the postmodernists are kind of on the right on that regard. There is sort of an initial assumptions you kind of have to make about the world. I mean, you have to assume the world exists. You have to assume that there isn't a dream, etc., etc. And whether or not there's a God or not is just another one of those kind of assumptions that you make or don't make. And maybe some people believe God based on evidence, but it's not really required for you to do so. But then again, also the existence of free will, the soul, all that jazz, that all can be entirely axiomatic. It can be just, I assert it, I don't have evidence, I don't need evidence. It seems right to me based on what I have available. And there's no person that exists, I think, that doesn't have axioms. Unproven, unevidential axioms that they don't have. I think everyone has these axioms. And it's simply a question of whether it seems more reasonable or more fruitful for you to have those axioms than to not have them. And so having some clarification on that would be rather useful. I want to make a point, though. I actually agree with a lot of some of the stuff that you were saying. I just want to be clear on that. Let's see. Oh, you made a comment on an omniscient, omnipotent being. And I found this kind of fascinating because one of the arguments that this is an argument I've actually put some thought into. One of the arguments that you're making is that since God can hypothetically, if he existed and was all-knowing, he would know the results of any outcome. Well, there are two problems with that. First off, it's not entirely the term omnipotent or omniscient isn't well defined. So it's not necessarily to suggest that God's not omniscient for not knowing something that is fundamentally unknowable. So that doesn't necessarily prevent him from being omniscient, unless you're going to be very strict on that for no reason. Because again, this is a term that's not well defined. How you define it matters. So there are situations in which it's not possible to know something, and it's entirely within the realm of consistency to suggest, well, God simply knows all that is knowable. He just doesn't know things that isn't knowable. That's within the realm of reason, and he still can be considered omniscient. But let's assume that he can know things that are unknowable. It's not necessarily against the possibility. Maybe God's above physics. Who knows? But the point is with that then is just because God might know how something will end doesn't necessarily prevent there from being stochastic processes. That is, there still can be chance and reason while still knowing the future. I mean, you can roll a die, you can videotape someone rolling a die. That doesn't necessarily stop there from being chance in that moment. And so when the person's rolling the die, there's chance. But, say you just fast forward the movie. After you've recorded it, you watch it again, and at the end, you can watch the person rolling it, but that outcome's been decided by the time they roll it. There's nothing stopping God from simply just perpetually being in the future relative to everyone else. That's entirely consistent. You can't argue necessarily from what I would assume are your assumptions based purely on physics and based purely on the common understanding of metaphysics, that it necessarily follows that if there's an omnipotent God that you can't have, that you have to have determinism, or that necessarily knowing the future causes it, because you don't have to have God in this. You can have time travel. I prefer time travel anyway because it removes the religious element out of it. So why is it necessarily impossible for time travelers to hypothetically exist? I'm not saying they do. I'm saying hypothetically. Why can't time travelers exist, know the future, and yet you still have the ability to make the choice? It doesn't necessarily follow that you can't, that your decisions are necessarily predetermined. Relative to them it might be, but relative to you it might not be. And it's not entirely clear that time is linear. I mean, keep in mind that Einstein showed that time is relative with space and the speed of light. So clearly time isn't necessarily intuitive. So we shouldn't go into a discussion about time and temporal determinism carrying that baggage with us that, the world should be intuitive, because the world's not intuitive. I think that's pretty clear. There are a lot of non-intuitive aspects to the world, and I just don't see evidence that one should assume that time has this intuitive idea that you can have, one person be making a decision and then have someone else observe that decision, and necessarily the observation come before the person making the decision. Or come after. I think it's entirely possible that the world can be wonky enough that if you can have two brothers going at two different speeds to a star system and back, that one brother can be older than the other. If you can have that world, it's not entirely outside the realm of reason that you might possibly have a world in which you can observe someone making a decision before they actually make the decision. It's entirely possible that time allows such a thing. Unless you can show that time doesn't allow such a thing, I don't see how you can make that argument. And that sort of goes into the next point with evolutionary free will. I find it very highly dubious. This is a side issue. It's not really a major argument. But I find it kind of strange that evolution seems to have primed us to believe a thing that is false. That seems kind of strange. Why would evolution prime us to believe something false? I'm finding that very unlikely. I would like to have a good argument as to why it is that evolution has primed us to be where universally believing in determinism almost always leads to hell. If having a deterministic viewpoint is so toxic, why would that be the natural state of the universe then? If the universe is deterministic, why would that obtain? Wouldn't you expect a deterministic universe to support evolutionary processes that would benefit beings that have the correct opinion as towards determinism versus free will? I found that a little lacking. And then you also mentioned that we just may not have enough knowledge, and I want to counter that real quick with it's entirely possible that there are true things that are simply forever unknowable, and so there are definite factual limits to our knowledge. So I would be careful with using that terminology like we just don't know enough yet. There might not ever be a yet. It might never come. There are things we know we don't know. Like there are theorems in mathematics that we know for a fact we can't prove them. And it's not that we can't prove them true. It's not we can't. It's not like it's like there's not like that. Like it's like, oh, it's false. Therefore, no. It's like we don't know if it's true or false or not, and we know we can't know whether it's true or false. But it still is either true or false. We just can't know it. There are lots of things like that exist, and so there are situations in which no matter how knowledgeable you might be, you can never really know those things. Only like maybe an omnipotent God could possibly know such a thing, if he exists at all. All right, next thing, Descartes and subjective, again, minor critique. I'm not seeing a lot of evidence that Descartes came up with subjectivism. I mean, he seems to have come up with sort of like a subjectivist base starting point, but he seems to have gone pretty hardcore objectivist with his acknowledgement of God. I mean, Descartes really brings the idea of God into the picture specifically for objectivism. So to suggest that he's a subjectivist or in the source of postmodernism seems a little flaky. No, Descartes simply suggested that because God exists, according to him, we know that the material world exists and is consistent and is objectively true. So he wasn't suggesting that there's, all the world's subjective and we can't, no, he was suggesting that the world's objective, it's there because God says so. I mean, you can disagree with him on the God said so part, but that doesn't change the fact that he was suggesting the world was in fact objective. And then I just want to piggyback on something earlier that was mentioned with the more moral reasoning bit. And I wanted to, so Vecna's dilemma, and I just want to I'm about to close. Actually, I should probably close right now. I'll get back to that later. I'll make a new video on that if need be. But anyway, thank you for making the video. I appreciate your content. And I do apologize for this absolutely horrible audio. I am recording off of my laptop mic, and I am completely green when it comes to these video things. I think I've made one, maybe two videos. I think I took one of them offline. I'm just not good at this, but I wanted to make a response because I appreciate your content, and I wanted to toss something into the conversation. Anyway, thank you for listening if you've gotten this far without, like, throwing away your speakers. I appreciate it, and thank you and have a good night.